Chapter 4. I am a happy princess wandering in the woods, Princess Pulverizer sang out as loudly as she could, all alone with no one to protect me. The princess's voice cracked on that last note. She probably should have paid more attention to her music classes at the Royal School of Ladylike Manners. Princess Pulverizer stopped singing and waited for the ogre to come capture her. But the door to the castle didn't open. Still, she wasn't giving up. She was going to get captured by that ogre no matter how much singing she had to do. Being captured meant she would be brought inside the ogre's castle, and once she was in there, she would get her hands on the Queen of Schmergermeister's jewels. I'm all alone, Princess Pulverizer sang, much louder this time. Just picking flowers with no one watching over me, and did I mention I'm a princess? She waited for a moment and started at the door. It still didn't open. What was wrong with this ogre? Didn't he know it was his job to capture princesses and drag them into his castle? La 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 la, Princess Pulverizer sang, so loud and so out of tune that it sounded more like squawking than singing. Click! A lock opened. The door to the castle swung open. The ogre stomped out with his dirty fingers shoved into his hairy ears. Noise bad, he grunted. Princess Pulverizer scowled. Come on, my singing's not that bad. Bad, the ogre grumbled. Very bad. Well, if my singing hurts your ears, Princess Pulverizer said angrily, I'll just keep my mouth shut then. Fine, the ogre bellowed. He turned and started back into the castle. Wait, don't you want to capture me and hold me prisoner in your tower? Princess Pulverizer asked him. The ogre looked at her strangely. No sing? He asked her. The princess shook her head. No more singing. Okay, the ogre said. He took her by the arm and began dragging her inside. Then I capture. Princess Pulverizer sighed. It was about time. You prisoner, the ogre said as he led Princess Pulverizer up the last and steepest staircase and into the giant tower. The princess could not believe her eyes. What a dump! There were strange objects piled in her mound from floor to ceiling. Bent forks, crusty spoons, dulled metal knives, a broken hand mirror, silk scarves, copper tea kettles, frying pans, broken teacups, and chipped dishes. What is all this junk? Princess Pulverizer asked. Treasures, the ogre barked at her. My treasures. Treasures? The princess questioned. This is just junk. My treasures, the ogre repeated. You no touch. Princess Pulverizer looked at a large silver ladle that was covered in a crusty yellow film. No touch, no problemo. Not touching that nasty stuff. But a few minutes later, after the ogre had shut the tower door and left, Princess Pulverizer realized she just might have to dig through this pile of junk after all. The ogre had called this stuff treasures, so maybe the silverware, coins, pots, and pans were things he had stolen and wanted to keep for his own. If so, it was possible that there were some real treasures in this mess. Treasures from a jewelry box that was stolen from the Queen of Schmergermeister. Princess Pulverizer had no choice. She reached into the pile of disgustingness and began to dig. After sorting through the ogre's treasures for what seemed like hours, Princess Pulverizer still had not found a single jewel. The Queen of Schmergermeister's jewelry box was nowhere to be found, but it had to be there in this castle. Princess Pulverizer had seen a queen's crown on the ogre's head, and she'd caught him playing with the gems. Those jewels had to be somewhere else in the castle, but where? Zzz. A little while later, the castle suddenly began to rock and rumble and rattle all around. Zzz. Princess Pulverizer gulped. The ground was vibrating beneath her. It felt like any minute it would open up and swallow the castle whole. Zzz. And what was that terrible noise? She'd never heard anything like it before. Wait a minute. Yes, she had. That was the same sound Lady Frump had made one afternoon when the palace chef gave the girls a lecture on how to properly eat cucumber sandwiches. The lesson had been so boring that even Lady Frump had fallen asleep. And then she'd started snoring. Zzz. That was it. The ogre had fallen asleep. His snoring was so loud it was rocking the whole castle. This was Princess Pulverizer's chance. All she had to do was find the jewels, grab them, and make her escape before the ogre awoke. How hard could that be? Pretty hard, actually, if the ogre had locked the tower door behind him when he left. Quickly, Princess Pulverizer raced to the door. She jiggled the doorknob, and then the door popped open. Silly ogre, he'd forgotten to lock the princess in. Lucky for her, the ogre seemed pretty new to this capturing damsels thing. As she quietly made her way down the stairs from the tower, Princess Pulverizer smiled smugly to herself. The quest of kindness was going to be a piece of cake. Zzz, zzz, zzz. The snoring grew louder and louder as the princess neared the ogre's chambers. Finally, she reached the room and snuck a peek through the open door. The ogre was sleeping face down on the floor with his rear end high in the air like a giant ogre butt mountain. On the other side of the ogre butt mountain was a beautiful velvet box encrusted with jewels. This has to be the Queen of Schmurgermeister's jewelry box, thought Princess Pulverizer. The ogre was keeping his newest, shiniest, nicest treasures close by. Big ogre butt mountain. Princess Pulverizer slid quickly and carefully around the sleeping ogre, making sure she stayed far from the humongous body. When she reached the other side of him, Princess Pulverizer snatched the jewelry box. She shoved it into her knapsack and started back toward the door. As she reached the doorway, the princess glanced over at the ogre one more time. That's when she noticed the sword beside him, probably another of his stolen treasures. Something like that might come in handy. Maybe she should just take it in. Zzz, zzz. Before the princess could grab the sword, the ogre let out the loudest snore she had ever heard. And then he began to roll over. Yikes! Princess Pulverizer leapt out of the way just in time. A moment later, she would have been crushed under the weight of the great giant ogre. That was the good news. The bad news was the ogre was now awake. And it's never a great idea to wake a sleeping ogre. No escape! The ogre grunted as he leapt to his giant feet and grabbed the princess with his massive fingers. Back to the tower! And with that, the ogre threw Princess Pulverizer over his shoulder and carried her back to the tower at the top of his castle. He put her down in the room, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. Clearly, he had learned his lesson. The princess was now trapped in the tower, stuck in there with all the smelly, moldy junk, and she had no way out. This was not a part of her plan. Let me out of here, Princess Pulverizer shouted. Let me out! Chapter 5. Grrr! Princess Pulverizer was mad. Really mad. She couldn't believe she'd been stuck in this ogre's tower for a whole night. Her plan had been going so well. She'd gotten into the castle with no problems. She'd found the queen's jewels and stolen them back. But here it was the next morning, and she was still stuck in this ogre's castle. And it wasn't like anyone was going to be looking for her or even missing her. No one, not even her own father, would be expecting her. Not for a long while. After all, performing 8 good deeds took time. It would be weeks, maybe months, until the Knights of the Round Table would be sent to look for her. Not that she really needed help, because there had to be a way for her to get out. And if anybody could figure out how to escape, it was Princess Pulverizer. The ogre was big and strong, but he wasn't very smart. And smart could always outsmart strong. That was why they called it outsmart. Duh. All the princess had to do was think her way out of this room and out of this mess. Except it was really, really hard to think on an empty stomach. Boy, was she hungry. Thump, thump. Suddenly, the whole castle began to shake. Thump, thump. Princess Pulverizer gulped. It sounded like the ogre was walking up the stairs to the tower, but what did he want now? Had he figured out that she'd stolen back the queen's jewels? Princess Pulverizer sure hoped not, because there was no telling what that big stupid lunk would do if he got angry. Sniff, sniff, you! Oh! As the ogre got closer, a terrible smell wafted up into the tower. It smelled like dirty feet and underarm sweat. Princess Pulverizer frowned. That giant monster didn't just need a haircut, he needed a bath, too. Click! A moment later, the ogre opened the door. He shoved a bowl and a spoon into the princess's hands. Food! He bellowed. Then he turned and left the tower, locking the door behind him. The smell of dirty feet and underarm sweat filled the tower, and it didn't leave with the ogre. That was because it wasn't the ogre that smelled bad. It was the gruel he'd served her for breakfast. Ew. The only good thing about a breakfast like this was that the princess didn't have to figure out which spoon was the proper one to use when eating gruel, because princesses did not eat gruel ever. Still, she was hungry. And this was food. Sort of. So she took a spoonful, swished it around in her mouth, and spit the nasty stuff across the room. Ew, this is disgusting, she shouted. I want eggs in a roll and some cold juice. The princess waited for a moment, expecting the ogre to hurry back up with a new breakfast, perhaps on a tray this time. But Princess Pulverizer didn't hear any footsteps on the stairs. Maybe the ogre hadn't heard her. If he had, he surely would have returned with a better meal than this. I am a princess, she shouted louder this time. I do not eat slop. Are you bringing me my breakfast? Are you out there? Answer me! Do not worry, damsel in distress. Surprisingly, the princess got an answer. Only it wasn't the answer to her question, and it wasn't coming from inside the castle. It was coming from outside. Princess Pulverizer hurried to the tower window and looked down. There was a young knight standing below. I will save you, the knight called up to her in a squeaky, nervous voice. Princess Pulverizer frowned. That little knight didn't look like he could save a mouse from a cat, never mind a princess from an ogre. Luckily, the last thing Princess Pulverizer needed was saving. She could get out of this mess all on her own, thank you very much. Besides, if this little knight got involved, he'd probably want to share the credit for returning the Queen of Schmurgermeister's jewels. That was not happening. Not when Princess Pulverizer had already gone through so much to get the jewels back. Go away, she called down to the little knight. You're ruining everything. Don't worry, the knight called back. My faithful companion and I are here to free you, and... That was the last thing Princess Pulverizer heard from the little knight, because in just that moment, the ogre rushed out of the castle. He scooped up the knight with one hand and threw him over his shoulder. With the other hand, he reached out and grabbed some sort of creature by the tail. The princess didn't have time to get a good look at what kind of creature it was. All she knew was that it was bright green and surely the size of a fat horse. Thump, thump! The ogre was coming up the stairs again. By now, the princess recognized his footsteps. Thud, 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 thud. Those weren't the ogre's footsteps. They were loud and heavy. But they didn't belong to the ogre. They had to belong to the creature that had been captured along with the knight. Thud, 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 sob! The princess heard a loud, mournful roar. It sounded way too loud for any human to make. Princess Pulverizer had no idea what kind of monster could make a loud, horrible noise like that. All she knew was she didn't want to meet him. A moment later, the tower door opened. The ogre stomped in and clanged. He dropped the little knight right on his armor-covered rear end. Then the ogre yanked at the creature's long, green, spiny tail and pulled him into the room. Princess Pulverizer's eyes opened wide. The creature was a dragon, a real, live dragon. My prisoners, the ogre bellowed as he left the tower and headed back down the stairs. The loud crying started up again immediately. Surprisingly, the loud cries were coming from a human. The tiny knight was sobbing hysterically. Wow, for a little guy, he sure could make a lot of noise. Belch! Just then, the dragon let out a giant burp. A horrible smell filled the air. It stank even worse than that gruel the ogre gave her. Sorry, the dragon apologized. Sometimes when I eat too much, I get a little gassy. And I had a huge breakfast today. Princess Pulverizer shook her head. She was stuck in a garbage-filled tiny tower with a gassy green dragon and a blubbering knight. And she had nothing to eat but gruel that smelled like feet and sweat. This quest had become quite a mess. Chapter 6. It's getting a little crowded in here, Princess Pulverizer complained as she stared at her new companions. And there's no way out, is there? The white knight said. Sob, sob. Princess Pulverizer gave him a threatening stare. Don't start that again, she warned him. The knight took a deep breath and choked back his cries. Then he bowed. I am Lucas. Don't you mean Sir Lucas? Princess Pulverizer asked him. Not exactly, Lucas told her. I'm just a knight in training. I was, until I left night school. Princess Pulverizer couldn't believe her ears. This Lucas kid had left night school? Why would anybody leave night school, she asked him. Night school is the greatest place on earth. I didn't leave it on purpose, Lucas told her. I was kind of laughed out. Princess Pulverizer stared at him. Why? She asked. Lucas turned bright red. I just couldn't do anything right, he told her. I left my armor out in the rain overnight. Now look at it. The princess looked closely at Lucas's armor. It was covered with spots of rust. That's not the worst of it, Lucas continued. One time I was practicing fencing with my partner, and the visor on my helmet slammed shut. I couldn't see a thing, but I kept fencing. Well, that was very noble of you, Princess Pulverizer said. Actually, it was very stupid of me, Lucas corrected her. I kept waving my sword around and around, and I had no idea that I was actually fencing with a tree branch until it fell on my head. Princess Pulverizer started to laugh. She stopped when she saw the expression on Lucas's face. It's okay, Lucas told her. Go ahead and laugh. Everybody else did. Princess Pulverizer smiled at him. That really doesn't sound so bad, she said. Certainly not bad enough to make you leave night school. Well, there's kind of also one other thing, Lucas said, but it's really embarrassing. Princess Pulverizer stared at him. It would have to be pretty bad to be more embarrassing than fencing with a tree branch. You see, I'm a... Lucas began. He stopped mid-sentence and leapt up onto a wooden stool. Mouse! He shouted. Princess Pulverizer looked down. Sure enough, a little gray mouse was scooting around on the floor. You're afraid of a mouse? She asked Lucas. He nodded. I'm pretty much afraid of everything, Lucas admitted. The other guys nicknamed me Lucas the Lily-Livered. That really hurt my feelings, so I left. You left, Princess Pulverizer asked him. But where did you go? Where do you live now? I don't have a home, Lucas said. I've just been wandering the woods. For a while I was alone. Then I met Dribble. It's been good to have a friend. Dribble? Princess Pulverizer asked. What kind of a name is that for a dragon? Well, what's your name? Dribble asked her. Princess Pulverizer, she replied proudly. What kind of a name is that for a princess? Dribble asked her. It's a great name for a princess, Princess Pulverizer insisted, especially for a princess who is going to go to night school. Night school? Lucas asked her. But you can't go to night school. Princess Pulverizer put her hands on her hips. She stared angrily at Lucas. And why not? She demanded. Lucas gulped. Well, because you're a princess. There's no rule that a princess can't be a knight, she told him. My father, King Alexander of Imperia, has decreed that I can go to night school. After I do 8 good deeds. Have you done any good deeds yet? Lucas asked her. Well, I was in the middle of doing one when you guys showed up, Princess Pulverizer told him. I have retrieved the Queen of Schmergermeister's jewels from the evil ogre, and when I get out of here, I will return them to her. How do you plan to get out of here? Lucas asked her. Well, I don't know that exactly, Princess Pulverizer told him, but I do know it would have been a lot easier for me to sneak out before you and your dragon showed up. Now the ogre is on his guard. He's going to be watching us all very carefully. Well, we just wanted to rescue you, Dribble told her. He let out another belch. The powerful, smelly wind knocked the princess to the ground. But not even a dragon burp could keep Princess Pulverizer down. She scrambled to her feet and glared at him. I don't need your help, Princess Pulverizer snapped at Dribble. Why does everyone think girls need rescuing? I can get out of here by myself, and I can do 8 good deeds all on my own. In fact, a smile flashed across Princess Pulverizer's face. Thanks to you, I am going to get to do 2 good deeds today, she told Dribble. Thanks to me? Dribble asked her. Yep, the princess said. I am going to steal that ogre's sword, and right before I leave the castle, I'm going to slay you. Dribble stared at the princess with his huge dragon eyes. But why would you want to do that to me? He asked her. Because dragons are mean, Princess Pulverizer explained. They breathe fire and burn villages. Think of all the people I will save if I slay a dragon. But, Dribble stammered. He seemed too shocked to answer her. You can't slay Dribble, Lucas told the princess. He's my friend. He's not mean at all. Don't you breathe fire? Princess Pulverizer asked him. Well, sure, Dribble told her, but not to burn villages. Then what do you use your fire for? Princess Pulverizer asked. Lucas turned and smiled at Dribble. Show her, he said. She said she wanted to slay me, Dribble said sadly. A giant dragon-sized tear spilled out of his little eye. Show her, Lucas repeated. Princess Pulverizer turned to Lucas. You're asking a fire-breathing dragon to breathe fire in here? Are you nuts? He's going to burn this place down with us in it. Wait and see, Lucas told her. You're never going to believe what Dribble can do.